What's going on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099 here to examine X-Men 131. I said a couple of videos ago that you could divide the Dark Phoenix saga into two smaller stories. The first half with the Hellfire Club as the main villains and the further corruption of Jean that we've been seeing over the last several issues, starting before the Proteus storyline began with Jason Wyngarde, and then the second half of the Dark Phoenix saga with the Shi'ar and the more cosmic part of that story. But really, you could divide it into three parts. The first three issues, if you buy the Dark Phoenix saga trade paperback, at least the one that I used to have many years ago, it starts with issue 129, and the first three issues is the introduction of Kitty Pryde and Dazzler, and in this issue, Jean Grey is able to read the mind of one of the Hellfire Club goons and finds out, okay, he works for the Hellfire Club, and they're able to figure out where the X-Men who went to Chicago, where they are. And then the rest of the Hellfire Club part of this begins in the next issue. But really, you could subdivide the Dark Phoenix saga, what a lot of people consider to be all the issues of the Dark Phoenix saga, into three smaller storylines. So even though you look at the number of issues contained within the Dark Phoenix saga, I think I said in one of my other videos that it was like 11 issues. It's not quite. I think it's like 9. Really, if you look at it as smaller storylines, then it's not as alarming that there was a storyline that lasted that long back in the early 80s. And I won't say that's alarming, because when you get to like Crisis on Infinite Earths in 85, that's a 12-part story, but it doesn't seem like at this point in the early 80s, late 70s, that we have had that many really long stories in the X-Men. But we are getting to that point where writers and creators are testing the waters, saying, okay, they're okay with having a 3-part storyline. What if we had a longer storyline? Or what if we had a bunch of storylines and they're all kind of interconnected? The very beginning of this little chunk of the Dark Phoenix saga starts with the X-Men in Muir Island. And when you read that, years ago when I read the Dark Phoenix saga in trade paperback, I wanted to know, okay, what are they doing in Muir Island? Oh, Banshee mentioned Proteus dying, and then Colossus mentions murdering Proteus. Okay, there was some other storyline going on here. And that is, I mentioned recently, one of my other videos, that the X-Men were seen as a soap opera. When you turn on any soap opera, it will start right in the middle of something. It's picking up from the previous episode, and then you'll get a little bit of development on some subplots. Something might be resolved, but then something else might pop up, and then that episode will end on a cliffhanger, and then they will continue that process forever. That's how they keep some soaps going for 20 plus years, and that was the formula that Claremont and Byrne were working with here, but they weren't quite as tacky as soap opera tends to have the reputation of being. But anyway, in this issue we open with what I feel like is a very iconic shot of Kitty Pryde running towards the camera. It kind of reminds me of John Romita Jr.'s page from one of the early issues of the Mutant Massacre, where the Marauders are hunting one of the Morlocks who is running with a member of the Hellfire Club. I'll get to that issue whenever in a few years, but that issue also begins with some people running for their lives. But this issue, Kitty is running from some Hellfire goons, and then Jean saves Kitty. There's a little bit of Kitty terrified of who these people are. It's weird because when Kitty first met Storm, she said she knew who the X-Men were. They just had a big fight in Scotland. And so she is aware of their fight with Proteus. But then here, she doesn't seem to recognize Cyclops, Nightcrawler, or Phoenix. And Phoenix just saved her life, and she knows that. But for some reason, she's scared and she runs from them. But then she is calmed down. She tells them what they know. And then Jean is able to basically use one of the Hellfire goons as a puppet. And so she, Cyclops, Nightcrawler, and Dazzler, they all pretend to be unconscious in the Hellfire Club car, while the Hellfire Hellfire Goon tells the other Hellfire Goons, hey, I've got the X-Men here, I'm going to go ahead and bring them in, and then Kitty, meanwhile, sneaks in and releases Wolverine, and then Wolverine takes care of some Hellfire Goons. She does mention that Wolverine is about as tall as her, but he's really heavy, and I know there's another issue in the last, like, 4 or 5 that mentioned how Wolverine's bones are much sturdier than normal. I feel like I read somewhere, somebody once said they really didn't think that Wolverine actually had adamantium-coated bones until the Days of Future Past storyline, where we see another iconic shot of the Sentinel blasting Wolverine and leaving just a skeleton behind. That was kind of what cemented the idea that Wolverine had adamantium-coated bones. But I'm pretty sure they are at least pretty heavily leaning into that here, well before the Days of Future Past storyline. But here, at least it's kind of hinted, okay, there's more than meets the eye with Wolverine. But then Jean is able to find where Emma Frost had Storm locked up, while Kitty is able to free Professor X, Colossus, and Wolverine. And then Jean, she's having some kind of psychic fight with Emma Frost, and then the building collapses on itself. And her and Storm are fine, but she says Emma wasn't so lucky. And it kind of leaves it up to your imagination what happened with Emma. Later on, obviously, we will see that she's fine. She becomes a major part of the X-Men. I seemed to have this idea that Jean kind of left Emma catatonic, like just completely obliterated her mind. But I think I may be confusing that with something else that we may be seeing somewhat soon down the line. But I seem to recall Jean kind of leaving more of a mark on Emma Frost here, and it could be that I'm also thinking about, there was an issue of Grant Morrison's new X-Men run where Jean kind of takes a forced tour of Emma's mind, and Emma kind of hints that this isn't the first time you violated my mind. Maybe I'm just kind of mixing up X-Men stories in my mind right now, but it doesn't really appear like Jean is having a psychic fight with Emma, but Emma isn't completely helpless here. Emma uses her powers back against Jean, and that seems to be what destroys the building anyway. But then they go back to Kitty Pryde's house, and Kitty's parents are furious because Kitty was with the X-Men, and then the building they were in was destroyed. Kitty's parents had no idea where Kitty was, and then Jean just flippantly uses her abilities to erase the Pride parents, erase their memories, or at least alter their memories somewhat, and Cyclops is alarmed. He says, you know, this is something she would never have done, and it's amusing because you go back and look at the 1960s, and you would be hard-pressed to find an issue where the Professor doesn't do that with his telepathy. There's that issue where they're fighting the Juggernaut, and Johnny Storm comes to help them, and then the Professor essentially says, hey, thanks for your help, now I'm going to wipe your memories. They did that a lot back in the 60s, and now they're acting like, whoa, Jean crossed a line. How could she possibly have done something like this? Of course, whenever you get to the all-new, all-different X-Men in the 2013 or so, Jean... every day that ends in Y, she's violating somebody's mind. So this is the beginnings of what we will see with that version of Jean. And this kind of concludes the first little portion of the Dark Phoenix storyline. Since Jean was looking through one of the Hellfire goons' minds, and now the X-Men know who has been coming after them. Now they're going to try to take the offensive in the upcoming issues. And I will go ahead and say... I do kind of have a problem with the Hellfire Club. In theory, I kind of like the idea of them. In this issue, they say something to the effect of they want to make it to the top of all business, economic, and some other kind of societal circles. Basically, they want to take over the world, but through more of a covert means. You have someone like Magneto, who through brute force wants to take over the world, but the Hellfire Club, they're going to place their members in the top of the Fortune 500 companies, and they're going to rule the world that way. And that's a very interesting idea, but there's nothing illegal about being the CEO of Coca-Cola. And so now if the X-Men, or if the Hellfire Club were, torturing people in the basement of the Coca-Cola building, yes, that's illegal. But the idea of what the Hellfire Club want to do and how they want to achieve their means is not illegal. So they have to really twist the Hellfire Club into being very, very evil, even though what we find out here about what they're up to technically isn't against the law. Of course, here they kidnapped the X-Men for some reason. We don't really know why they did that. We know that they want Jean Grey on their side, and they're using Jason Wyngarde to do that. But we will find out a little bit more about what they're up to in the next portion of the Dark Phoenix saga. But that's something I've always found the Hellfire Club to be interesting. And even though we see them do some pretty heinous stuff in these issues, like blowing up their own people when they fail to do a mission, later on, the Hellfire Club will kind of have a alliance with the X-Men in the mid to late 80s, and honestly, I always found that to be something that made a little bit more pragmatic sense than them being considered villains to the X-Men. And really, since the mid-80s, the Hellfire Club hasn't been a major threat to the X-Men since then. There have been several times where someone might try to resurrect the Hellfire Club. I remember Claremont wanting to do it. He was doing something with the Hellfire Club in his Uncanny X-Men run in the mid-2000s. Joss Whedon and John Cassaday in Astonishing X-Men had a version of the Hellfire Club, sort of. You have all these different versions of the Hellfire Club that will pop up periodically, but they never really reached that level of being villainous like they're portrayed here, probably because on paper their ideas about how they're going to make it to the top really doesn't suit itself to an action comic where you want to see the X-Men punching villains in the face. And if Sebastian Shaw wants to take over the world through Shaw Industries or Frost Enterprises or whatever, that's not really something illegal, unless you have something like they're going to use this secret chemical and that's how they're going to take over this business or something like that. Then yes, that's obviously against the law and the X-Men would want to stop that. But this idea really lends itself better to what if the Hellfire Club were kind of neutral. They weren't full-on villains, but they're not necessarily friendly with the X-Men. They're kind of up to their own thing, and the X-Men aren't sure if they can trust them, but they're not necessarily bad guys that the X-Men are going to come into physical contact and conflict with. So that's one thing I've always kind of been on the fence about with the Hellfire Club. I like a lot of the Hellfire Club villains, and I like some of the stories they're in, but just the idea of, oh, they're our enemies because they're trying to infiltrate politics and take over the world that way. Okay, there's a whole lot of evil politicians out there. Are you going to fight them too? Also, speaking of making things more difficult on a narrative level, you have Dazzler here. At the end of this issue, she says that saving the world really isn't her thing, and she would much rather just focus on her music. And it makes sense. Everyone who has superpowers is not automatically going to want to use their powers to fight crime, but at the same time, as I mentioned in last week's video, if the intention was to create a multimedia character who's going to be present in music and a movie and also in comics, and then you say that she's not interested in being proactive as a superhero, and Marvel at this time was predominantly superhero stories, almost entirely. I'm sure they had Tomb of Dracula, I think, was still going on at this time. I don't think they had any of the romance comics going on anymore. It was almost entirely superhero stuff. Even something like Tomb of Dracula was more of a horror adventure comic, but you still had characters who are proactive, and they are grabbing the bull by the horns, and they are doing adventurous stuff. But if you have a character who flat out says, I don't want to go on adventures, I just want to be a musician, that's going to be a very boring status quo for this character. And already at this point, they were planning on giving Dazzler her own series. And I guess I should go ahead and say, I have no interest in going back and reading the Dazzler series. I have all of it. I have both volumes of Essential Dazzler. I read those in late 2019. There may be like 2 issues of that series that I will cover. I think the X-Men guest star in one of them, and there's another issue that Rogue is in. I will probably cover those issues, but other than that, most of the Dazzler series really really doesn't have any bearing on the X-Men. That would be the only reason that I would want to cover them, is if they had a major impact on the X-Men. And outside of those two issues, that series really doesn't. A lot of what happens in that series is kind of just quickly forgotten once Dazzler is folded back into the X-Men cast in the mid-'80s. So if you were looking forward to me talking about the Dazzler issues, I'm sorry, I'm not going to. So that is the last we will see of Dazzler for a while. I know she does show up again a little later before she's fully part of the team, but that's basically the last that we will see of her for a little while. And so that's about all that I have in this issue. We do see that Kitty Pryde doesn't really like Nightcrawler. She's kind of scared of him, and her kind of disliking him is going to continue for a little while. I know they briefly mention it in the Days of Future Past storyline. I'm not exactly sure when she is fully okay with Nightcrawler and is actually friends with him, but here we see even mutants sometimes. They're still a little standoffish against someone who looks different than them. And so subconsciously, the whole theme of what the X-Men is about is presenting itself here in a way that it normally doesn't. And so that's kind of interesting. So that's about it for this issue. So let's consider it examined.